Good day. In this video, I'm going to talk about what's the best approach to answer the weakness question in job interviews. Okay, and the first thing I'd like to draw your attention to is that instead of using a dumb weakness, you'd better use a generic one. Okay, so instead of using interviewing as a weakness you have, you'd rather go with something on the lines of public speaking. You know, everyone is using public speaking for the last decade or so, and it's still, it's not as if you will get disqualified if you use this, right? Now, what I would also like to highlight here, if you use public speaking, try to pitch it well. Okay, for example, public speaking is not necessarily a strength I have. However, I have no problem speaking to smaller crowds of known people, of colleagues, so to speak. However, whenever I have to talk to a large crowd, large audience of unknown people, that's where, I still have to learn. Okay, so the pitching must be appropriate, and you'd rather pick a generic weakness than something that doesn't really make sense. Okay, the second scenario I'd like to share with you is that on the topic, okay, but then how do I find an interesting weakness, right? Because you may not be happy with the generic public speaking. And my advice to you would be to try to look in the job description. Okay, the job description usually contains a section with nice to have, with the ideal candidates, what the skills they should possess. Okay, something that is not immediately required for the role that you're applying for, but would be very nice to have. And you could go with something from there. For example, I don't know, you don't have VBA, Visual Basic for Application Scripting proficiency, but you say, hey, I do have VBA basic knowledge for an analyst role. However, I'm still trying to learn about the more advanced methods of scripting using VBA. Okay, so basically you will go into the job description, find something that's nice to have, not core to the role, and try to pitch that with one of your specific experiences, because ultimately it's about the pitch, not as much about the weakness. But still, this would be an interesting weakness to talk about, something that would differentiate you from other candidates who, for example, might pick the public speaking way. Okay, the third thing I'd like to talk about here is a mistake that many candidates do with these weakness questions would be to turn a positive into a negative. Okay, so for example, I work too hard. Okay, so this will not fly with high-performing companies, especially because you are applying for a top 0.01% best paid jobs in the world. So guess what? You're expected to work hard. I do understand that some people might need something different by working too hard, but in the sense that dosing or having a more structured, organized approach instead of a best effort approach, but still it's still turning a positive into a negative, at least to my experience. Okay, so what can you do instead? Well, instead of turning a positive into a negative, you would want to focus on trying something that's actually true about yourself, such as I used to be a very assertive person when I was managing a small business, managing a PM. In the first 3 days of working with a new PM, I managed to make her cry because I was too direct. Okay, however, we ended up working together for over 6 years. So it was a successful outcome. However, I can be a bit assertive at times, sharp elbows, also called, right? So find something that, it's generally something that maybe, a number of years ago was an actual weakness. Find an interesting story, again, and you notice here the trend where I'm going to. It's about the story that you're pitching, not necessarily about the weakness, so long it's a good one, okay? But this would also play to your advantage, right? The assertive one is also a very successful weakness, so to speak, with many the people I work with, right? And the fourth thing I like to mention here with respect to what's the best approach to answer the weakness question in job interviews is that not everyone plays it safe. That is, to go with a safe weakness. Okay, so for example, people who can speak well and who have great stories can take risk with these things. Okay, for example, I've heard salespeople speaking about their weakness being consultative sales, which is something that would be assumed to be core to someone's role, simply because they had a great story. Okay, or a senior manager can talk about having a weakness of managing extroverts, so long they can pitch this with an amazing story to back that up. So long they make an interesting conversation and interesting discussion, and still at the end of the day they would sell themselves on their learnings and on their ability to pitch these things well. Maybe as a closing remark, you also want to pay attention to the way these weakness questions get asked, because in my experience, it's not always that they will ask you, hey, what's your weakness? But rather, do you have something you wish to improve on, professionally speaking, So there's all sorts of flavors they might reframe this question. So you could also, improve a little bit your listening skills around this. But long story short, this is how I would go around answering the weakness questions in job interview. I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.